Welcome, class. This is the final lecture of the course, and I'm going to rehearse some of the material that you encountered in the previous lecture, but I'm going to take you into the 20th century. If you were to ask where the center of global Christianity is 100 years ago, most people would say Europe and the United States. The majority of the world's Christians lived in Europe and the United States. That is not the case today in the 21st century. And today, the majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority of Christians live in the global South, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So this has been represents a huge shift in Christianity. And Christianity really began the process of globalization in the 16th century. After Northern Europe was lost to Rome following the Protestant Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church got very serious about finding new converts elsewhere in the world. And you had Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans traveling all over the world in search of new converts to Christianity. Matteo Ricci went to China, St. Francis Xavier to Japan, Bartolomeu de las Casas to the Americas. And these missionaries were very successful in turning the Roman Catholicism from a European religion into a global religion. The missions to East Asia took a very different flavor from the missions elsewhere in the world. In most of the world, when Catholic missionaries went, they sought to replace existing religions with Christian religion. In East Asia, the Matteo Ricci and St. Francis Xavier had a deep respect for indigenous cultures, for indigenous Confucian culture particularly. And this was a culture that was ancient. It was a culture that had a written scripture. It was a culture that had high morality. So what the missionaries in China and in Korea, China and Japan did is they sought to synthesize Christianity with the local faith. So it was quite a different model. Instead of replacing local faiths with Christianity, they sought to synthesize Christianity and the local religion. And I'm going to talk today about Christianity in China and in Korea. Matteo Ricci is probably the most famous missionary to China and one of the first missionaries to go to China. He dressed up like a Mandarin. He sought to endear himself and to influence the ruling class in China. The ruling class was the Mandarin class. He grew his hair and beard long. He wore a silk robe with long, wide sleeves and a tall, stiff black hat that reminded Ricci of a bishop's mitre. Ricci spent years and years mastering the Chinese language. It's a very hard language to learn. He wrote books in Chinese that were quite influential in Confucian circles. He brought mechanical clocks, oil paints, latest textbooks in astronomy and physics to China. And this won over many people in the ruling class. And it endeared them to Matteo Ricci, and they didn't necessarily convert to Catholicism, but he had very warm and good relations with the cultural elites. He identified Shangdi, which is a Chinese deity, the king, the ruler of heaven, as God, as the Christian God. And He also incorporated Chinese rites into Christian practices in China. This was controversial. There was a debate that raged for about a century in Rome about how far you can go in this process. How many Confucian and Chinese rites can you incorporate into a Catholic service and still call it a Christian? That was a debate. It's a debate actually that's still going on in missionary circles in East Asia. So this is a picture of Matteo Ricci. A Protestant kind of version of Matteo Ricci is Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor was a British Protestant missionary. He formed the China Inland Mission. He spent 51 years in China. He brought over 800 missionaries to China who opened 125 schools. He wore native clothing. He won 18,000 converts to Christianity. And he preached in several Chinese dialects, including Mandarin, Shanghainese, and Ningbo. And he was also an opponent of the opium trade. At this time, Europeans were forcing the Chinese to trade in opium. And there was a lot of addiction in China at this time. So he was a voice against the opium trade. And he promoted the idea of the faith mission, where you would not be supported by a church or a denomination, but you'd be supported by individuals and you would raise money from individuals who would send it to you, who would send you to the mission field and support you while you were in the mission field. Here's just a picture of John F. Kennedy with Pearl Buck. Pearl Buck was a missionary in China, and she really introduced Chinese missionary culture to America through her books. She wrote biographies of her mother and father, and she also wrote The Good Earth, which became a bestseller and won a Pulitzer Prize. This is a picture of Hudson Taylor. He's also dressed like a Mandarin. He wore Chinese clothing, spoke Chinese fluently, and really had a deep respect for Chinese culture as he was attempting to convert Chinese people to Christianity. One of the most successful Christians, though, was not a missionary, but an eclectic and pretty violent rebel in China, Hong Xiuquan. Hong Xiuquan identified as a Christian, and he fought a civil war in China that raged from 1850 to 1864. This was at the same time that our Civil War was going on in the United States. I often ask my students to name a civil war that divided North from South, left millions of people dead. And they always get this wrong. It was not the American Civil War. It's actually the Taiping Rebellion that I am talking about. The Taiping Rebellion was, the casualties were astounding. At least 20 million people died during the Taiping Rebellion. And Hong Xiuquan almost succeeded in overthrowing the Chinese government. But he did succeed in creating a state in the southern part of China that, and he ruled from the city of Nanjing in the southern part of China. He and his followers practiced radical asceticism, although he had many wives. Hong Xiuquan did. Missionaries were really excited about him in the beginning. They were really excited. They supported his rebellion, but then they quickly saw that his Christianity was odd and unorthodox. And by the time he was defeated, the missionaries were really disillusioned with this movement. He was practiced a kind of communism. He divided all land equally among people when he took it over. He was an iconoclast. He destroyed Buddhist and Taoist images, and he banned Confucian practices. So this was really a quirky Christian rebellion against traditional Chinese culture. This is a picture of Huang Xiaochuan. Here's another depiction of him. And here's a picture of one of the many battles that he fought. This is the area in red is the Hong Dynasty. This is the area that seceded from China and where he actually ruled for more than a decade. In the 20th century, China has had a really troubled relationship with Christianity and with missionaries. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a Boxer rebellion in which 250 missionaries were killed. This was a rebellion centered in Beijing, and it was a rebellion against Western influence in China. In 1911, the Emperor of China was overthrown, and a republic was established in China. And this republic was really governed by two Christians, Methodists actually, Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. There was a lot of hope in the United States that these leaders would bring China into the Christian fold, and they were disappointed. A civil war broke out in China, and Mao Zedong, a communist, atheist, won the civil war. And Mao Zedong pretty much banned Christianity in China. He banned all religions, actually, during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. And Christianity went underground. It became an underground religion. Deng Xiaoping allowed Christians to operate openly if they were part of a state church. But the state church has never been terribly popular in China. Most Christians worship underground. And President Xi, who's currently ruling China, has a very adversarial relationship to both Christianity and Islam. He has a friendly relationship to Confucianism and traditional Chinese religions. He said, if you got to practice religion, practice a Chinese religion. Don't practice one of these foreign religions. So Christianity remains very much an underground movement in China, and a successful underground movement. But it is dangerous to be a Christian in many parts of China today. This is a picture of Mao Zedong, Cultural Revolution. South Korea is a really interesting petri dish for the study of Christianity in the 20th century, because Korea is a divided country. North Korea is an atheist state where Christianity is legal. South Korea is probably the most Christian country on earth. South Korea sends missionaries overseas at a higher rate than any other country in the world. It's the number 1 missionary sending country per capita. There are maybe about 15 million Christians in South Korea, and yet they have had enormous influence on global Christianity. Now, Korean Christianity is interesting because it is a counter-narrative. Christianity was mostly brought by Europeans to Asia, but Koreans really discovered Christianity on their own. In 1777, Korean slaves in Japan brought Matteo Ricci's The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven back to Korea. They started studying Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci wrote in Chinese. Koreans can read Chinese. And so they started studying the philosophy of Matteo Ricci. He was the Chinese, he was the missionary to China that I had talked about at the opening of this lecture. And they discovered Christianity through reading him in Japan. When the first Catholic missionary arrived in China, he found 4,000 Christians in Korea. Korean Christianity was essentially a lay movement that had been operating for decades in the absence of priests, and it was a Catholic lay movement. The first Protestant missionaries began coming to Korea in 1800, and they translated the New Testament into Korean. Bits and pieces of this New Testament started circulating in Korea in the 1880s. It's very recent that Koreans have had scriptures in their own language. Korea is a small, relatively weak country surrounded by imperial powers, by China and Japan. Christianity, rather than robbing Koreans of their identity, actually shored up their identity. Christianity was a way of saying, we are different from the Chinese and Japanese because we are Christians. So it became a movement to preserve culture against Chinese and Japanese imperialism. When Christians talk about imperialism, they don't mean Western Europe and the United States. When Koreans talk about imperialism, they generally are talking about Chinese and Japanese imperialism. That was the threat to their culture, their identity. And Christianity was a way of asserting a difference vis-a-vis Japan and China. In Pyongyang, that is today the capital of North Korea, there was a great revival in 1906 and 1907, and I have just a short description of that revival. After a short sermon, man would rise, confess his sins, break down and weep, and then throw himself on the floor and beat the floor with his fists in a perfect agony of conviction. The Japanese occupied Korea in 1910 to 1945, and the opposition to the Japanese was the Christian church. The Christian church was the most effective opponent of Japanese imperialism. Here's just a quote from a Methodist evangelist. The Japanese have their armies to rally about, and we Christians too have a flag, a war. In times past, we were not a people, but we are now the people of God, a holy nation called out of darkness into his marvelous light. So the leaders of the liberation movement against Japanese were Christian clergymen and lay people. And because of this, Christians were viciously persecuted. Japanese troops burned churches and they arrested and executed Christians. After World War II, the Japanese were driven out of Korea, and the Korean War broke out. The war was really between Soviet-backed communists and American-backed capitalist and democratic forces. And this war raged on for 3 or 4 years. And finally, South Korea was divided. The North was communist, was under Soviet and Chinese control. And the South was headed in a capitalist and a democratic direction. The leaders of North Korea, since the establishment of the communist regime, have been Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il, and his grandson Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un is currently the ruler of North Korea. Christianity came to demarcate the difference between North and South. what it means to be a Christian, or excuse me, what it means to be a South Korean had something to do with Christianity. What it means to be North Korean has something to do with atheism. Christianity was illegal in the North, and it was sanctioned in the South and even encouraged in the South. Today, Seoul, Korea has more churchgoers on Sunday morning than any other city in the world. The biggest church in the world is David Yonggi Cho's Full Gospel Church in Seoul that was founded in 1958. North Korea developed this kind of cult of their leaders, of Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, the family, the Kim family. And here are just some pictures of the adoration. The grandfather Kim's body lies in state and is a pilgrimage site in Korea today. So there's a kind of religion revolving around the leaders there in North Korea. But South Korea is overwhelmingly supportive of Christianity, and they have these huge churches that are really thriving. And they also are a big missionary sending church. So that is really, I think the examples of South Korea, of China, represent the shift, part of the shift that is going on in global Christianity, the shift away from North America and Europe to Asia, Latin America, and Africa. These are the centers of global Christianity in the world today.